Welcome to Voices of Women. I'm Chris Danis, your host and also the founder of Women of Wisdom Foundation. We are having our 29th annual Women of Wisdom Conference on March 11th through the 14th, and for the very first time, it's virtual. So anybody from around the world can join us, and so we're so excited. And we have special guests, Louisa Tisch and Terry Tempest Williams this year, doing our main presentations in the evening. So you can check everything out on our website, womenofwisdom.org. Today I'm interviewing Ridhi D'Cruz. She's a panelist on one of our events on Sunday, March 14th. It's called Co-Creating and Sharing Resources to Reinvent Community. So Ridhi is a queer person from South India who moved to Wapato Valley, which is in the Portland area in 2010. They have dedicated over a decade to designing community processes that cultivate shared senses of place. Currently, Ridhi is the executive director of a grassroots placemaking nonprofit organization, City Repair Project, based in the Wapato Valley, or again, what's known as Portland. Ridhi uses their platform as a co-teacher for City Repair's Urban Permaculture Design Course to decolonize white-led organizations and movements, and especially the permaculture and placemaking movements. They facilitated conversations on power and privilege through Oregon Humanities Conversation Project from 2018 to 2020. Also, Ridhi is a council member for the BIPOC herbal medicine apprenticeship called the Atabey Medicine Program, where their focus is on collective liberation and healing justice. So welcome, Ridhi.
Hi, Chris. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you're going to be at this year's conference. We have quite an interesting panel of people put together for this conversation about community and reinventing community. First, I want to start with you about yourself. And you immigrated from Southern India. When did, I think it says 2010 you came. How old were you?
I was, I think, just beginning my Saturn return, so 28.
Okay. So you were an adult. So so great. So as an immigrant and also a person of color, I'm just curious, what was your impression of the US when you first came here?
Well, I think initially it was mixed bag, of course. I definitely panicked at one point because I'd never been to Turtle Island before, to the US, and when I landed in Baltimore and made eye contact with people and was really friendly, people were really suspicious of warmth on just from strangers, and that was kind of rattling. But then when I came to Portland, I think that there's a lot of parallels and connections between Portland and the size of the city, as well as its focus and love of plants and the trees and things like that. It's very similar to the place that I grew up in India, called Bangalore.
Oh, yeah.
And so I could, in some ways, I definitely felt like, wow, I'm in a different country and everything is very different. It smells different. The landscape looks so different. The people are really different. And then in some ways I was like, oh, wow, there's ferns, there's bracken fern here, there's bracken fern in India, not in Bangalore, but there's also so many common threads. And so it gave me a good, it's given me, I mean, continue to learn so much. It gives me good material to kind of think about what I consider normal, or what I consider just the way things are, and cultural, or just anything and everything, and how much of it is actually much more designed or pieced together through the cultures that we're born into or that we adopt, and that gives me a lot of like sense of taking more responsibility and intentionality around how I can move through life and the choices that I can make, especially if I'm more aware that there are choices that I am making.
Well, what was the choice about coming to the US? What brought you here?
Several things. The one that I want to highlight, I think, is that I wanted to see things from a different perspective. I'd reached a point in my activism in India where I just felt like I was hitting a wall, like a plateau of some sort, where I couldn't see myself getting through to the other side. And I think that it was my dad, whom I really love and adore and have a lot of gratitude for. So I want to give him credit for him, for his guidance on making me the troublemaker that I am. And I think at one point he was just like, you just need to go someplace and just explore, because I think, I mean, and of course, I come from middle class privilege where he sponsored my education, and not everybody has the ability to just travel abroad and do a graduate degree and all this stuff. So I recognize several layers of privilege that I come from and that afforded me that. But ultimately, I think it was that spirit of curiosity and knowing that that I was struggling because I questioned a lot of things that people didn't feel comfortable questioning.
In India or here? In India?
Everywhere, like
anywhere.
But back then it was, in India, and I wasn't really finding the mentorship that I needed to find my way through. And so I think just the let's try something different, this dramatic kind of change really helped me in many ways to just mix things up and look at things from a very, very different perspective. And I changed and grew so much and have become closer to my culture in many ways, which has been really beautiful. I think I had a lot of resistance and trauma around some of the limitations that I endured and perceive in my culture. And then I came here and I was like, oh, I'm definitely grateful for that, this, just helped me realize wow, trite things like the grass is always green on the other side or whatever. It just helped me put things in a different perspective.
Yeah, it's a great experience to change your cultures, and that definitely will. We spent 3 months in India in 1984, and I can think of, we traveled around the world, and I can say, I think the biggest differences I found being an American was in India in a lot of ways. I mean, there's so much diversity in India, and so many, it's very intense. It's because it is, you go to different areas and it's so different and the languages are different. And luckily you can speak English there because it was colonized by England. So we could get around with the English, but I think it's a great experience to travel and experience other cultures. And but to move to another place is a whole nother, a deeper level of that.
Yeah, and I'm not committed, I would say, yet. I think I'm committed to being a transcontinental being, because I think in so many ways these, boundaries are essential for several things. But I think our nation state borders are, they feel questionable to me, and they feel sometimes a lot more harmful than helpful. And I feel like my roots still belong in India, and I will find ways to bridge back my work, especially to bridge back to India. And it's starting to happen slowly. And so, I just consider myself a lifelong traveler somehow, even though I grew up in India. People, especially in my adult life there, even before I'd ever been out of the country, would think of me as a foreigner. And it was painful, also because I was like, why don't you recognize me as one of your own? And at the same time, I think that one of the teachings that's brought me is that not to take for granted that that everybody comes with this just programmed sense of belonging. And that's why in my bio, so much of my work centers on the practice of cultivating a sense of belonging, because I think from a very young age, I've had different ways in which that was either not given to me or taken away, or something that I've just struggled with. And as I've leaned into that inquiry of why is it that people perceive me as a foreigner in my own country of origin, what feels unrecognizable. And there's, the verdict is still out. I don't know why exactly that keeps happening, but I also think that the paths that I feel are potent, or like things that I want to claim and deepen into, is that not to take things for granted, that things are just a particular way, or Indian culture means one particular thing, or that there's not newness in traditions that are ancient, like just this new and old and living cultural ways of being are all things that I feel like I focused on in my anthropology, like working with and really really trying to delve deeper into what is culture, like what makes us of a place, and how do we relate to one another and relate to ourselves. Like all of these are questions that I feel like um, I will forever be trying to answer and asking more questions about. And I think that they allow me and others to really cultivate a practice of place that's rooted in justice, because we've experienced so much othering and oppression and violence and feelings of not feeling, I mean, feelings of unsafety, as a person who is perceived as a woman walking around in public space. Like that was one of my big challenges with India, is just um, is not really knowing um, how to work on the intersection of gender justice within the cultural norms that were present and are present. And there's so much, again, like, I don't want to get into these silos of like, well, in India, we're more backward with our gender justice. And I don't agree with that way of viewing cultures and traditions, but I just also think that there's a responsibility to speak to injustice wherever we are and wherever I am. And so I feel like, the racial injustice here and the gender injustice here and the caste injustice in India and the gender injustice in India, like I just think that injustice anywhere is
Right.
justice everywhere. That's another way of, thank you MLK and happy Black History and Futures Month. But um, yeah, so I just think it's been very formative for me.
Yes, and it made me think that culturally, like from a Western eyes, we can go, oh yeah, they're as far as gender equality in India, they're backwards. Well, there's cultural things that's not the case. You have to understand the culture, and we can't put our Western lens on that.
Exactly.
You live there, but so I'm curious, and this is not necessarily to do with the topic of the intentional community that you're going to be participating in Women of Wisdom, but this influence, but it is for your work that you do, how growing up in India has influenced your work here. And I want you to share about your work in the City Repair Project. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Wow. There's so many layers. So I started off by saying that it really is, for me, grounded in a practice of cultivating connection, relationship, and a sense of belonging to myself, like my own body autonomy, and what what do I actually deeply consent to, and what do I not, and like what's my purpose, and those kinds of more metaphysical ways of thinking and being. And then there's another level of like, what's my relationship to other people, um, whether that's neighbors, colleagues, coalitions, affinity groups. Like, how am I in relationship with other human beings, and cultivating a collective sense of belonging in that way. And then how am I cultivating a sense of belonging to place or to land? And again, as in like being not from here on Turtle Island and coming here, it's been really profound how accessible it's felt for me. I think just because of the incredible Indigenous land stewardship that's happened and is continuing to happen here, how those pieces of like how we can live as close to being respectful and Indigenous to place as we can be. Like, how do we be a good guest on stolen land? And so I think that those are the three kind of spokes to this wheel of like a placemaking practice that I've been cultivating. And it definitely started off in India, where as I was growing up, we experienced like an incredibly devastating amount of urbanization, and like it was something like, I can't even remember the numbers, 400% in the span of 20 years, and 85% of the urban canopy being decimated in another, like just the time that I was born and was growing up was a very in like industrialization in India, like the nation building from having independence from British rule. Like we were in a very pivotal moment, and then I think our economy also liberalized, and so there's just a lot of factors, like big scale things happening that caused the city that I grew up in, that I thought I would live and die in, to feel completely alienating to me. And you know, we have 350 species of birds, and it's like such a city, it's such a metropolis right now, and it amazes me that we still have that much bird diversity, which is remnants of what used to be and what I grew up in. And so as life itself became commodified, and I felt that growing up, you know, we could run around and play, and there's so much like open space and lychee tree and this tree, and you just climb and stuff your face and then take it home, and dad's making gooseberry pickle. Like things just felt a lot more fluid and shared, like common spaces, and a way of living in deeper collaboration and connection with land. And then suddenly it was like gated communities, apartment complexes, trees being cut, like birds. I can't hear the bird song. It's traffic, it's dust, it's like scarcity, these big buildings going up with like the sheeny glass windows that are essentially greenhouses that then require massive amounts of energy to cool them. And it's just so I don't have words. It was extremely traumatizing going through that as a young one and not knowing what these forces were, which are global imperialism, primarily emanating from the US. And wow, and growing up in that, I was just like, what is happening? And I remember finding my way to nonprofit work, participatory technology work. So storytelling has always been a very important thread of mine that I've carried through from my days in studying journalism and doing English literature and participatory media. And I just have always been like, stories are so rich. There's so much of a person that is imbued in the stories that they can share. And so yeah, I was influenced by some artists in India, where we were painting walls in Bombay. I lived in Mumbai for 2 years, and my friend at the time, Danya Pailo, had what she called the wall project. And she was just like, you know, bought paint and would just whip it out and just be like, we're going to paint this wall, and kids would come and everybody would come, and it was this very public affair. And public space use is very different in India, so I want to preface that as well. And I also want to preface it by saying that I literally lived through the imposition of a much more like planned urban grid that kind of commodified life, like I said earlier. Like I watched that second wave or third wave or whatever wave, like it really kind of come down on us. And so we, along with some friends, we were painting walls, we were like resisting, subverting, telling alternate stories and things like that. And then when I came here, I met a few people in India actually who told me about City Repair Project. They were like, oh, you would really like it. They do urban building, they work in public space, there's artwork, you're a creative person. And I was like, cool, it sounds interesting. And then I got here and I was like, this is really fascinating that this interfaces so much with public space work, and the commons is really important. How we resist the privatization of land with the delusion that we think that we own land, and how much harm that has caused over time. And so I found my way to City Repair. And then, of course, you know, we're in Portland, one of the whitest cities in the country. And from the get-go was talking about racial justice and Indigenous, like land back and reparations, but I didn't have that language because I was so new here. And so I'd summarize and say that for me, coming from India with a very rich tapestry of commons culture, from my culture is from Kerala. We have traditions like Ayurveda and sacred groves that are protected. And so I feel like there's a lot built into my blood and ancestry that I'm still reclaiming. And And there's so much that is still present in our elders. We still have elders. Like my dad was born years before independence in 1947. So we still have that cultural connection. And in City Repair, it's been a really hefty journey of pivoting the organization to a trajectory that honors the unsafety that BIPOC and women and femmes and people who are frankly not white and male, primarily, our safety in public space is something that we don't design our society around that. And so pivoting the organization to work on these themes of justice where we consider not just like, oh, these are pretty paintings on the street, which is what I think we're most commonly known for, but who feels comfortable, who resonates with the spaces that we are making, and who are they for, who gets to enjoy them, and who got to create them, and whose identity does it reflect back and resonate with and uplift, and who are we invisibilizing, and who's at the table making decisions with us, who's not, and a slew of other questions that I think that placemakers, permaculturalists, urban designers, architects, public land managers, just people from so many different fields, we are just beginning to ask some of those deeper questions where Black, Indigenous, immigrants, Latinx, like all of these groups of people who've been so marginalized, like I finally see some recognition of the contributions and the origins in our cultures and in our work that these fields have drawn and extracted from. I finally see some kind of recognition of all of that happening now, where we're like, oh, wait, I guess some of this stuff around fire, like controlled fires and how we need fires needed on our landscape, Indigenous people were doing this, like, this way of place tending and place making and placekeeping. It's just been so whitewashed by this narrative of like, I don't know, John Muir style environmentalism, or, I don't know, like some other, like Jane Jacobs and whoever else is like in architecture, all these figureheads that we look to for inspiration, when actually I think the inspiration for me and for several others comes from the struggle, the strife, the resistance to colonization and to various forms of abuse that people of culture have really utilized as ways of survival and thriving through all of these times. So that's what I root into in the contemporary work of City Repair, where we are really centering place justice as much as we can and moving away from the narratives and outcomes and projects that continue to benefit people who are already in power and who this society is designed in a particular way. And so how do we actually shift the power, share the power, so that we can all be liberated? And that's for me the real important question, is not just like community building without the framing and rooting into justice. Like if we don't have a justice oriented lens, then everything becomes imbued with colonization, patriarchy, like whatever it is, all the isms that we're really trying to design and respond to and transcend and liberate from.
It seems like, so I'm wondering, what impact do you think the work you're doing and other people there at City Repair Project, are you seeing changes? I mean, I think one of the aspects is it is educating people about that placemaking and about kind of all the things you just talked about of because it's so ingrained in us, we who have were born here, who have lived in this system, that we kind of take things for granted and not think about, hey, there's another way, and how do we change? And also just the block of how do we even change that way? It's just so huge of how the culture is, how the corporate and capitalism and all that, how it all impacts us. And so I think it seems like one of your roles is to educate people to think beyond, what the impact is of all these aspects of our culture, how it impacts all people.
Yeah, and I would say personally, I love being an educator. I will confess to that. Like, educators have saved my life. I was just in a conversation before this where, oh my gosh, the violence of the education system. And then when you find a mentor who actually like meets you, like connects with you and sees the potential and calls you forward, like that has saved my life throughout my education, like throughout my long journey with education systems of various sorts. And so I consider that a sacred duty that I just feel compelled um, to contribute to. And I also love learning. And I think that that's why I call it a practice. Like I consider myself a place practitioner because it's a practice of place. And I've pivoted away from educating around like, it's more, how would I word this? It's more, I'm trying to pivot. Like, I definitely hold critical inquiry. I mean, I'm an anthropologist and I definitely have like the social sciences, like that kind of what's the word, like, resources and thinking to kind of draw on to be very kind of structured in my analytics of like how are we identifying, how does power influence, what is culture, how is history and time playing into this. So I can do that left brain kind of like deconstruction and analytics, which I think is helpful. But then I also think that critical inquiry is needing balancing with appreciative inquiry, which I think comes a lot from knowledge systems of wisdom cultures and indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is based in that. And there's so many other like ways of knowing that balance with Western science. Because I love science, and then but we need other knowledge systems all working together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like what I'm kind of moving into with my role, which is difficult in its own way, but I think it's really about um, supporting and reflecting back to BIPOC folks, especially, and the different intersectional identities we have within BIPOC, because BIPOC is just such a like blanket term and it doesn't really account for the nuance. But just really like having a practice, a vulnerable practice of like, what are all the ways in which we like oppression lands upon us and is internalized, and what does that look like? Oh, that looks like a sense of, always feeling like we're not good enough, imposter syndrome, no matter how many degrees I have or get or whatever experience or whatever role, I will always feel like I'm not like that, there's something lacking, or and truthfully I need to work twice as hard as somebody with white skin and with male privilege or whatever, right? Like, these are actual things that have been tracked. There's quantitative data on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that appreciative inquiry and like uplifting and that kind of peer mentorship and collective galvanizing is much more the learning spaces that I find myself gravitating towards and wanting to create and co-create for ourselves to heal. Because I think that with the dismantling work, which is necessary, comes the regeneration work that balances that death and life cycle. And so I feel personally that it's been I've been in city repair since 2011, first as a volunteer and a placemaking site project leader to a co-director. And I feel like right now we are much more working with who are the BIPOC folks in the country and what do you all need to imagine and enliven your visions. And that's why I said Black history and futures. Like, what are the futurisms that we want to radically imagine and breathe life into? Because I think this notion of creative justice has been really important to me, where I think that the seed of the future is held within those most marginalized by the present day. And that's a huge responsibility. And that's why I say that we have to gently shift our focus from who we thought to be figureheads and leaders, and instead see the leaders within us and within each other, and really like center the folks who have been just so harmed, like Black women, Black trans folks, non-binary folks, Indigenous folks, the immigrant folks, folks who don't have citizenship here. Like there's so many ways of intersectionally looking at who this society by design oppresses. And from those people, our imagination needs to generate the futures that are liberatory for everyone. Because I hear a lot like, oh, I have to give up power. Like if we have power, I have to give up power for it to equalize or for equity and justice. And I think that's a really like short-sighted way, to put it bluntly. It's a really short-sighted way of thinking that that I don't feel like I can really gain when I'm gaining by somebody else suffering. Like that to me isn't a gain. It's not, it doesn't, that's not a liberatory practice. And so if we all are to uplift each other and be like, wish each other well and bring ourselves into wellness and healing and equilibrium and balance or whatever, like from the plant life and land-based living to, and the more than human world to the human world and to our personal worlds, then, you know, collective liberation is liberation for all. And I feel like the more I really sit with that, the more I understand that my role within it, and where I need to also lean back and allow people who are far more marginalized than I am, like hold space and remove barriers so that they can take their rightful place at conduiting and dreaming our future into being. Because I will not be able to imagine, I certainly can't do it on my own, A, and then B, I just think that that creative seed really needs to come from those most harmed by our present. Like there's just, the creative justice is just so central to my work now, thanks to the freedom, the like 2020 summer, like just all of the incredible Black organizing work and Black visionary work that has happened and continues to happen. I was just like, wow, what does it mean to live in an abolitionist world? Like, what does that look like? What's the practice of radical love that we need to bring into our lives so that we don't need to rely on these power over kind of scenarios in so many facets of our life. And there's a lot of work to be done, but it's exciting because I think so many of us are yearning for it, and we're ready.
Yeah, it is exciting. And you mentioned things like, so you and Portland was very much active this summer. Seattle was too, but you know, the whole nation heard about Portland. But you know, sometimes we just hear the negative things, and then it tears people away from, you know, I think we want to hear the positive things that Black leaders and Black people who aren't even leaders, people who just, you know, people, BIPOC people who are getting involved on maybe just a level of talking with other people, that we don't hear those stories that are hopeful, that give us hope, that are showing what people that are marginalized that you're talking about, what are they doing? You know, it's almost like it's how can that be brought forward to the rest of the world, you know, to encompass everybody, you know, include you know, white people who want to hear these stories too, who want to, because you're talking about, I guess the danger, maybe it's not, I don't know if it's a danger, what am I thinking of, but it's the separation of, okay, there's white culture and there's people of color. Do you see it ever coming together, that it can be, you know, working together, co-creating together, and all voice? And for me, it's all about all voices being heard and honored, and everybody has a place at the table.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what the question I'll put back is, do white folks realize how much whiteness harms them?
Oh yeah.
And you know, and I don't, like, in the rooms, in the circles, in the conversations that I'm in, I don't really think that people have really sat with that and unpacked and followed that thread, because it leads to a lot of grief, and it leads to a, like, wow, so many things need to change. And again, I think people are in that inquiry. I am, because just because I have brown skin doesn't mean whiteness as a system isn't, like, kind of, you know, it's in my being. Like there's nobody, I would argue that there's nobody who isn't touched by white supremacy culture. And
Mhm.
I think that we have um, different ways in which we are each grappling with that. And so my current thinking on it is, for me personally, I feel a lot more. I've done education work. I've like done workshops. I've facilitated conversations. I've done a lot of work with white people trying to be like, hey, this is whiteness. This is how it harms you. This is how it harms me. And I'll share frankly that I don't see that as my work anymore. It's not my principal form of work. It's not my work to tell people to present something and expect them to change and then be heartbroken when they don't.
Mhm.
And that's the truth of it. Like, because then I think that there's a sense of like an expectation that I'm bound to be disappointed, because we take time to change. I'm not saying that
Mhm.
change doesn't happen, but I just feel like the more, like what I feel much more called to do, which is much more open-ended and creative and explorative, is to hold that space and say with BIPOC folks and say, what does it mean for us to heal? And I think that's a very different question for BIPOC folks than it is for white folks. And I think white
Right.
folks need to be asking that very same question.
Yeah.
But who holds that space? Like, I don't want to be in the room where I continue to be harmed by, I like whatever it is that the person's processing. Just as for me in my non-Black identity, I would want Black folks, like, absolutely, we need more Black spaces. To y'all need to talk about what does Black love and resilience and celebration and joy look like. And then the rest of us who are not Black, we need to talk about anti-Blackness and how are we showing up with doing our work and noticing how anti-Blackness harms us and how we're like projecting that onto others and harming them. And so at every level, I think that um even to just draw on anthropology theory, like identity is a very like colonized way of thinking about things, that it's static and I'm just like this, I'm just BIPOC and I'm just like a woman, or I'm just blah blah blah, like we're thinking about it in a very like noun state, when in reality our identities are relational. They are based in terms of like our relationships with time and place and with each other. And so when thinking about identities, like I have to think about how I identify as a transcontinental being, and as someone with middle class background, and as someone who's perceived as a woman, and as someone who's on and on and on. And at every step of that way, I need to think, where is the power that I can take back to, like, and the responsibility and the agency that I can take and hold? And then where am I feeling like somebody's like these structures, this institutionalized patriarchy or this institutionalized global imperialism or whatever it is, like how is that kind of confining my agency, and how do I want to work with that and push back against it, and have a kind of like dynamic relationship, because nothing exists in a vacuum. And I'm not gonna like, ICE is never gonna just go away. Like like immigration, like none of that stuff is just gonna, I think, vanish. I hope it goes away, but you know what I mean? Like I have to be able to design my power and my life force with as much creativity that I can, with the parameters that I have in front of me, and how I choose to work around them and bend them and um, recreate them and whatever else. So yeah, I think that it's a both and. I think that I cannot do my work in BIPOC spaces if I don't hold my Indian identity with, I don't know, unknown caste privileges that have been erased and sanitized from my storytelling. Like I can't, um, that's not someone from a non-dominant caste to do for me. That's my personal responsibility and my work. And then I think as I unpack that journey, then hopefully I'll be able to find my own way into caste solidarity and the struggle um, for liberation in an Indian context, because it's not just in like, I can't cherry pick and say, yeah, I'm fighting for liberation in the US, in Turtle Island, and then completely deny like all of the issues that are prevalent with the largest protest in our known history, or like documented history of the planet, happening in India with our farmers. So it's a very multifaceted question, and I think there's no simple answers, and I think most people just want an answer. They're just like, Ridhi, give me a list. Like, how do
Yeah.
I be a good white person, or how do I support BIPOC people? And I'm like, you're not gonna like it, but it's a practice. And just like it's a practice of learning how to be with plants and listen to plants, or whatever it is, like any other practice, I think that it's the same thing around racial justice for me. That's been my experience with it, and I have so much more to do with my own racial justice journey. Like, I just feel like it's a life practice, it's a life commitment. I have to take very personally that the well-being um of my of Indigenous people who are just devastatingly hit by COVID, that's by design. That's our system that we've designed. That the Black neighbor, or like the Black child, and what is that Black child's sense of possibility and futures. I feel like, as a designer, as their neighbor, as another human, as another sentient being on this planet, I feel like if I don't design my life um, in consideration of relationship to all beings, um, then what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing then. It feels very pointless to me.
Well, you've shared a lot here, and it's kind of showing, you really work in this intersectionality of, placemaking and justice, and all and the oppression, and it really brings out all the issues that we're kind of dealing with. Um, and and I know, I think made me think of when you were talking about, well, the Indigenous people and learning from them. There's also a backlash of, well, we're not the inappropriate appropriation of Native American cultural aspects, and that we want to, maybe we're a little even jealous of that, of what they have, because we've lost it from our own culture. And I've heard people talk about, okay, I'm Norwegian, to go back to my own culture and find those roots, find those ancestral roots, that we all have them. And yet there's that, that romanticizing of the ancestral of Indigenous people, of Native Americans or whatever, that we want to incorporate what they have, because we've lost it in a way. I mean, I'm not that far from my roots, because my father came from Norway, and there's a deeper connection, but many families have been here for centuries, and there's a loss of that culture.
Yeah, and I can't remember what Instagram meme I saw. I have been enjoying Instagram a lot these days, because I just think there's so much good content there, and I think that this is why I really feel like if we like cultivating a practice of being with our trauma as it lives through us, as it lives through our lineages, and also moving away from thinking about things in totalitarian kind of like thinking, or dualities, where just pushing back against that. Like, when I felt, for example, I was like, I don't feel connected to my Indian culture. I grew up in a city, and I didn't live on a land base, and I hear snippets of Ayurvedic like practice and lifeways through what my parents tell me, but I just there's this constant, I think, feeling of disconnection, which is again by design. The way that things have been designed is to trick us into thinking that we are disconnected, and to some degree we are disconnected, but I also am a firm believer in our immense capacity to reconnect. And I think that means going through, like, there's just no way around the pain. I think we try to like, oh, I'll just like reach around the side and access like indigenous lifeways from somewhere else, or go under this feeling of heaviness and lack of belonging, and do this thing. And it's basically we're letting a hungry ghost within us drive, like a feeling of a lack, let us drive, and then we start getting this like grabby kind of codependent relationality with things that don't honor, like, wait, did that person consent, or did that culture consent? Is that even possible? Like, what's my energy coming into it? And again, we want like these answers from people that I don't think that there's clear-cut answers. They're really about checking in with ourselves and being respectful, and working from a place of integrity, which can be co-created to some sense, but I also think those are deeply personal questions, and we all make mistakes, and it's going to be like, I just think healing is, we're just all on a healing journey, I hope. And I think that in my experience, colonization, like our human story is so complicated, and we all come from so much trauma, so much disconnection, so much displacement. And I've been gardening for a very short time, and how much I fall in love with my gardens every time. And then when I get displaced or I have to move, it is like so painful. And that gives me a window into what my ancestors probably experienced being like with their land being taken from them. Like I kind of imagine that land trauma that lives within us, because we've all come from, and we all come from those lineages that had that severance to our land base and our culture. Like everybody, I think, has been touched by that in some form. And so I think to recognize the depth of that trauma, and so then when we try to reconnect with land-based practices or with community, that's ever present, that's there, it's always the elephant in the room. And if we don't tend to that trauma and steward that trauma like with responsibility and accountability, it's just gonna leak out and cause a lot of havoc and damage. And so that's the kind of like way I like to think about cultural respect versus, and cultural appreciation versus appropriation, is that ultimately, and I even think about it sometimes in terms of energy, like ultimately, what energy am I bringing to this, and who is it benefiting, who is it centering? And if that's like mostly benefiting me, because giving benefits, feeling wanted and desired, like when we're doing charity, right, like the giver receives so much benefit. And I don't think there's anything shameful about that. Like we need to feel wanted and desired and whatever, that we're being helpful. But I think that ultimately, if I'm taking away and getting more than I'm giving, and like that a culture or like a group is receiving, then I think that there's an imbalance in power. Again, these are not easy things. Like I'll go along for years thinking like, yeah, that was solid, I did a great job over there or whatever, and then 2 years later I'll read something, or I'll have an awareness about some acknowledged trauma or unacknowledged expectation or desire or need or whatever, and be like, whoa, yeah, that was in the room when all of that was happening. And it just like, again, it's about that commitment to relationships and how we bring integrity back into our relationships, and personal care and love and collective care and love, and going from there. And to me, once I think about it in that way, I'm like, oh, it's pretty simple. There's all these big words, but ultimately when rooted in love, like an active way, like love as an action verb, like bell hooks kind of love, and care. I'm just like, it's not that we don't need like socio-political theory and anthropology and like some workshop and trauma this. And I think those are helpful. I'm not like discounting their relevancy and utility, but I also just think that we're just trying to be in deeper relationship with each other. I don't know how else to say it. It's just, it can be really simple as well. is what I'm saying.
Yes, well, I'd love to end with that and the focus of love, and it's that love and respect and honoring of other people, and putting yourself in other people's shoes instead of throwing what we think the world should be onto others. And yeah, and just being with everybody in a respectful and loving way. So I appreciate you bringing all this to the conversation, and look forward to having you be part of the community panel. It's sort of my thought is it kind of expands the whole sense of community, that when we talk about intentional community, what does that really mean? And you're bringing, like, this interrelationships of kind of everything in our culture comes back and interacts with community and how we are with everybody. So thank you so much, and we look forward to having you at the conference. And again, Ridhi is going to be at our panel on intentional recreating communities, and that is Sunday, March 14th. And there's lots of workshops all week long. We have, let's go to the website, womanofwisdom.org. There's March 11th through the 14th. We have workshops, we have the panels, we have evening events, and you can go all weekend, or you can just buy a day pass if that's all the time you have. So this is Christina's, host of Voices of Women, and I'm not sure when my next show will be, but someday in the future. I've already interviewed all the Women of Wisdom presenters, so you can find them on our website. With everybody's workshop are the interviews with everybody on womanofwisdom.org. So thank you.